All right, so our plan for today, first one is just criminals, our keyword, pretty straightforward word, but I want to try to talk a little bit about it in a way that connects to the novel, like we thought, that's kind of the way, that's the method, right, to use the keyword to kind of open up the novel a little bit. So that is my idea here, and that means that we'll have a little bit, because we only have one keyword, that means we'll have a little bit more discussion of the novel in the first part of the period than we have in the past couple days. And then, although I'm trying to always keep them working together, right, rather than sort of keeping them separate. And then second turn to finish up the novel. Everyone should have read it by now. And there's already been questions people have asked that I said, oh yeah, we'll pick that up by the end of the discussion. So today's the day to kind of tie together loose ends and think about the novel, The Water's Edge, on the whole. Let me just turn the light off up here. So, a term like criminal, obviously, we all have some notion of it. But the question I wanted to start with was, who's the criminal in The Water's Edge, and why? So let's just start there. And maybe we just kind of talk to people sitting next to you about that question, who's the criminal? And we'll just use that question with the novel to turn then to the keyword, and then we'll come back to the novel, take a break, and then, as I said, there's some questions, bigger questions to talk about the novel to tie things together. So just start there. Who is the criminal here, and why? And let's take a few minutes to start with that, and then we'll turn to the class to hear what people had to say.
She's laughing over here. It must be true. Is that the vibe I get? Yeah, good sure. I don't even know this guy. She's my friend.
Okay, let's hear what people had to say here. So the idea, kind of my idea in asking the question is it presumes some notion of like what the criminal is here, and obviously, as we've talked about already, that's kind of one of the problems in the novel. It wants to sort of ask us about the status of the criminal. That is, like, what is it? What makes it? Why criminal, and so forth. So the idea in starting with that question then is to sort of raise the definitional problem that underlies any argument about saying who's the one. Okay, so where did you start? Let's hear what people had to say. Point the finger. Yeah, Hannah. Okay, Brain or whatever, Brain.
He committed the crime of murdering, or well, I guess he didn't murder him, but he assaulted Jonas.
Okay, so he certainly like we could say a criminal act of kidnapping and sexual assault, right?
Yeah.
Certainly criminal actions, right? But I guess in a from the perspective of genre, though, right? We usually expect murder, and we may say, well, is he a murderer? It's like a manslaughter case or something like that. Charlie, then Gabrielle.
This is actually a question.
Uh-huh.
Like witnessing someone die and not doing anything about it. What is that called? Because technically he didn't murder Jonas.
Right.
It was an accident that this happened, and he just couldn't respond.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I believe that that's not a crime to not act in the case, or is it?
I don't know what the laws are like.
We're the Law Society Justice people here. You're supposed to know these things.
Like, I know things like here.
Yeah.
You can get in trouble for not helping someone when you have the ability to. Like,
What's fault here, though?
I can't remember. I think it depends on the case. What charges they bring.
Gabrielle.
Oh, I had something completely.
Okay, did you?
On that point,
Yeah.
too, though, I think in certain places there also, I think it depends on if there's like that good Samaritan,
Mhm.
or like if you do try to help the person and they die anyways, then you can't be pinned for like murder.
Okay, so that you're not legally responsible if you try to help someone
And it's like.
and you do something that hurts them.
Well, not even necessarily if you do something that hurts them, but like if you try and it just doesn't help them.
Yeah. I don't know the law, so so I can't answer the question. Susan, you had your hand up there? Do you know?
Yeah, a death that occurs during the commission of a felony, which the sexual assault and kidnapping would be, is considered a separate crime. It's felony murder, they call it.
Felony murder. Okay, so it's not. It's a certain count of a murder charge where death.
Intentional first degree, murder, but it's if you go into a bank to rob it and you shoot a guard, you didn't mean to kill him, but you died.
Right. Although that would be a different situation, right? Because you're armed and firing, or
armed or not. If it's a felony, if the
Right.
kidnapping or the rape is a felony,
is the consequence of the felony
what you're doing,
is death for some. So then, in this case, it's not just that he can't get the asthma inhaler to him or whatever, but that the sexual assault has a consequence. The consequence is an asthma attack. The consequence of the asthma attack is death. So it's a felony murder according to
in America.
in the United States. Yeah, Marina.
I was looking at this up this weekend, and
Okay.
manslaughter, it's unintentional, but something did happen to cause the death, so it's called manslaughter.
Well, I think manslaughter would be a situation in which you weren't involved in a felonious act, but because he's kidnapped and raped this boy, right? That he's in the act of committing a felony, and the consequence. I think that's the point. That's the difference between manslaughter and felony murder. Is that right?
Right, and the second boy's death is probably more a manslaughter.
Right. So that there's no intention to kill there, right? But they take action that results in a death. Yeah, Gabrielle.
Oh, yeah, that's one thing I was going to add to the criminal.
Okay.
I feel like the friend or
Right.
I feel like they're kind of criminals. Maybe not in the same sense as.
And for what did they what did they do?
Essentially, like murdering their friend. I know it didn't start out that way. It was kind of like, oh, for fun, like he can't get out of the hole. Quick, just pulls it on him.
Okay.
They had time to go back and help him, and they never went back and helped him. And I feel
Okay.
like that is.
Kieran, and then I think Pete.
I feel like
Okay, so parents. And what did you say that what was their?
I mean, through the
Okay, so through their mistreatment of their children. We'll put S. Sociopathy. I don't know, what do you call them when they stupidity. So you can think about what their problem is. I think Pete had his hand up.
I would say I feel like in the book they really criminalize like both the parents and the kids who died, especially the fat guys.
The mothers.
Yeah, like the mothers, but like Edwin was like the chubby
Okay.
guy.
Yeah.
Who like she kept like feeding him and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And that led to his abuse through the students in school and stuff. And this could have led to.
Okay, so parents. I'll put mothers. Right. Treatment of children of. You said criminalized. Ben?
I forget his name, but I think Tula's boyfriend, the con artist.
Right, okay.
That was it. So, he was just in the con her, and then I think I remember reading how she gave him, like, investments already. She gave him, like, a ton of her money already. And it seems, like, book doesn't say specifically he's in the con her, but it implies that he's going to do it, so. Just, like, con her out of money.
Right. Which is, I mean, this is obviously not the main crime, but you can see right away it's drawing all these parallels and trying to push us to these sorts of places where you're thinking about the status of the crime, what's criminal, and of course when Sayer, right, confronts him, he says, "They gave me the money. I didn't do anything wrong. They gave me the money." Right? And of course, that's that kind of thing where someone who is skilled in persuading others to do things that they may not want to do or seizes on people who are vulnerable to persuasion, right? The transaction, on the one hand, it looks like he's using her, but on the other hand, he defends himself. They wanted to give me the money, right? So this is, again, one that the setup is the setup criminal to have a relationship. Lots of people give money to people they love, right? Is that illegal? So I think part of what you need to look at if you're writing about this novel is recognize that all these parallels are kind of devices to try to push you to think about the main crimes and their sort of status as violations, criminality, whatever you want to call it. So this is a good one to point out because we could say associative. And like associative raises issue of criminality. Okay, other ones people thought of or wants to point out. Yeah, name? Leah. Okay. Okay. And what's the charge against him? Yeah. Today's the last day on this novel. Okay, so is Reinhardt up? Okay. Although, if you remember the passage, we look at it later. It does. It's sort of very ambiguous, right? The whole thing, and purposely so. I mean, you're reading it one way, but people could read it another way, perhaps. But certainly, is he a pedophile here as well?
And then also the fact that the photos during the investigation, that seems
Okay, so also. So then he also photographs the body of the victim, right? So maybe it's a misdemeanor, but some kind of criminal act, perhaps. Pete, follow up?
I just feel like he's kind of just like they use him as like an image of like whole society, like being like people like interested in like these kind of like horrific scandals, like their own interest, like for like the adventure, not really like actual.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is that there's a lot about him, but also key elements are held back or withheld in a way that leaves who he is and what he thinks open to interpretation. You have to make an argument about it. You can't sort of say this is the way it is, right? Does Pete suggest he's the everyman here, right? Or the every person, that he's obsessed with the photo, but we're all obsessed with the photo, right? Everyone knows that. That's the way the tabloids work. Let me give you an example. That just as an example from Finland, but there, if you like look at surveys the last 20 years, people say they think crime is going up, but crime has actually decreased in like total number of crimes occurring annually. So why do people have that impression? And one of the reasons is they've increased the size of the photos on the tabloids, which are on the street every day, and you see them and you sort of expose them, and increased the size of it and covered crime more, put more images of crime and criminals, mugshots, that kind of thing. So people extrapolate from those images and their sort of obsession with them, the idea that crime is rising in the society. Just like, if you watch Cops all the time, or you sort of consume media and images that depict crime as rampant and threatening to you, you tend to have this notion that crime is more prevalent and of a greater danger to you. So the question is then, is Reinhardt kind of like the viewer of those images, obsessed with these images because he, like many of us, watches them all the time, sees them all the time, right? And so in a sense, his criminality is this kind of like prurient interest, this sort of childlike obsession with images of crime and criminality, right? Jake?
I was going to add on that. He also kind of has an obstruction of justice in a way, too. Because when he's, when they go to the grocery store, the convenience store, or whatever it was, and they see him there, he chooses, he's like, he's so selfish in his ways that he decides that he wants to follow him all the way back to his house instead of just calling the police and saying where he's going or what car he's driving, what license plate number. It's like he instantly has to be incredibly involved, and that could be either risky to him, his wife, or anybody else.
So he's this kind of like amateur investigator that sort of like becomes this like little sleuth.
Yeah, in a sense where it could actually hurt the investigation because he's trying to be so involved.
Right, so that by inserting himself into it in these various ways, he endangers the investigation to the point, as Jake suggests, of almost obstructing justice, right? So there's, again, like these sorts of various ways in which people... Are there other characters here that seem to have some criminal status? Derek?
What about Christine?
Okay, what about Christine?
I don't know, I thought that she kind of did like a one-night stand with Reinhardt and raped it because he got pregnant.
Okay. I guess they're... let's see here. So we'll say, right, I mean, it's the marriage, right, is the defense there. Not in a serious way, right, because there's obviously it's actually interesting to think about rape as a good instance of a crime, right, that we talk a lot about, and there's a lot of, right, consciousness raising about various scenarios in which rape can occur. And it goes to the point of crime and the criminal a little bit because it's something that's been criminalized, right, in the last maybe 20, 30 years, in the sense that many sort of crimes of sexual violence, like domestic violence, for example, were not considered criminal 30, 40 years ago, right? And society has changed in our notions of gender, the relationship between gender, and those have been increasingly enforced and criminalized in the sense that what was 30 or 40 years ago thought of as a private matter, sort of, in a sense, gets criminalized. So, and then is open to legal prosecution, right? So that these kinds of things are, I guess, a part of the novel as well, since it is a novel about, sexual transgression, sexual violence, and so forth. Though that's, I guess, a little bit of an interpretation of what's going on there. Other thoughts about criminal figures? Let's take a second here then to before we turn to the keyword. I want to ask then. Some people have sort of offered, in thumbnail sketches of like why, but just choose one of these and ask and make your case for why. What is it? Why is the person a criminal? Obviously, Hannah began with Brain and saying, well, and we talked about felony murder versus manslaughter and so forth. That's an argument. That's an explanation about what it is that he failed to do or did do. But maybe we could take some of these other characters and just ask yourself, why are they? Why would you argue that they're criminal in the novel? What does the novel do to cast them as criminals? And we'll use that then to turn to the definition of the word, and I hope that will help us deal with some of these ambiguities. Take a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll talk about it as a class.
I thought that's what you were about to say. I was what are you trying to say?
Well, no, I didn't say that when I was talking They might not
Okay, let's turn back to the class then and hear so just choosing one of these examples, why would you argue that this particular character should be designated in this way as criminal? Anyone want to start? Garter, yeah.
I think in particular Sveta's dad, because he beat him, and that was a big reason why the kid wouldn't come forward and really say what it was. It was so important that he had to go back out that night that they trapped Edwin in the cellar. Okay, so the father's beatings of his son, right, are the source of the criminality. That's where the problem begins. I mean, one of the things just to think about here is that if we think about the keyword, right away you see that the problem in defining the criminal is between the legal, a legal definition and a moral definition. We can say that legally, right, it's the violation of the law, and if the court can or the prosecution can prove that the law has been violated, that's how we designate, right, this sort of have a guilty. We find that's where guilt lies. But of course, here, as Gardner observes, right, it's the moral violation that's the real issue. You can't nail the dad for the sort of on a manslaughter charge. Couldn't find a guilty finder, even prosecute, right, the father for a manslaughter charge against Edwin. But where's the problem? Where's the moral problem? Right, it's in the mistreatment of the kid by the father. That's like the precondition in a way to suggest the novel on Gardner's reading for the crime itself. So this is the kind of scene the thing works over and over again, right? Where it wants to push back to the sort of the conditions that make possible these things that happen. Did you want to add something, Susan?
Isn't it a crime sometimes to beat a child?
Right. I mean, obviously, there's a separate crime there to beat a child. And as I mentioned as well, in these Scandinavian countries, very strict laws actually relative to the treatment of children and corporal punishment and so forth. So it's very interesting, actually, those sorts of things. Just as an aside, it'd be interesting. I'm not going to do it, but just think to yourself: if I asked you yes or no, is it ever okay to beat a child or like spank a child like beyond a certain limit? What would your answer be? And the reason I ask is because just this story I always remember. My wife is a public defender, and she had a case where this guy, he was separated from his wife, and then he was taking care of the kid, and the kid was having all these problems in school, kind of acting out, whatever, and he got sent home from school because he stole, he had actually beat up some other kid in school, and then the father hit him, and there was nothing came of it, but then the wife said she hit him too hard, so it was kind of like about the relationship between the wife and this estranged husband and child sharing problems. But the thing is that, but it went to a jury trial, and he ended up actually getting off. And what it was, is that a lot of people, we think it's never okay to beat a child, but actually people, at least in the United States, a lot of people feel like it's okay to spank a child, and then when there's those sort of ambiguous circumstances around it, then we're sort of willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the parent, right? So, which was funny because in this case, I guess this guy then, he then ended up getting in a fight at the IMA. 6 months later, my wife heard and got an assault charge there. So maybe he did go too far. But it's just I just offered as an example to think about something like this where, when you go into the details and you start peeling away the layers, you can see there's always ambiguity there. And I guess the example is just to remind us in thinking about here that there are these cultural differences, but also we too as readers bring a lot of notions to what we think is okay and not okay. But certainly here, the novel certainly wants to suggest, right, that the mistreatment of children is at the root of the problems that are here in this novel. And the question is, who's mistreating children and what's mistreatment? Right? If you're writing about the novel or you're writing about that question about children, that's one place to look is what is mistreatment? For example, Annelina in Copperheart, right? Is that what's the source of her eating disorder? Is that a mistreatment that's at the bottom there? Those are things to think about. So this is one Gardner's pointed out here. The father's beatings of his son seem to make him, prone to mistreat others, right? That pattern of repeating the abuse. Other thoughts here about other characters and criminal status. Yeah, Cassie.
So the two boys, Sarah and Isaac, it definitely wasn't manslaughter, that was a serial murder. Manslaughter happens when it's an accident, and they made a willful decision to leave there, so even if it wasn't premeditated, that was straight up.
Okay, so Sarah and Isaac murder, and see, walk us through your reasoning here.
Okay. So, we were just talking about this earlier. Manslaughter happened when it kind of wasn't, the death wasn't intended on someone to still be kind of committing a crime. They gave an example of speeding and hitting someone with your car and killing them, right? You were speeding, which wasn't right, but you weren't trying to gun someone down. So, But they said that they could go back that night, but they said it took them like 6 days to die. Die of thirst, and like for the entirety of that 6 days, every time they made the decision to not go back to that valve, they made the decision.
So they're obligated to recognize, legally obligated to recognize the consequences of their action, and imprisonment without food or water is going to lead to death. You know, everyone knows that, and so it's a murder when you subject someone to that kind of neglect, and as a result, it's a conscious choice that they make not to go back to let him out of this bunker or whatever. Jake?
I guess kind of another good way of explaining it is like those two kids are probably well aware that you don't have food or water, you will die. So once they did make that conscious decision to just not go back, release him, or provide him with either of those things, then he would die. It's not like that was something they were taken back by. You know, it's not like they were doing something and then suddenly he died. And they didn't.
Right. So it's in a sense then they're I mean, right, to sort of step out a second, they recognize from a very young age, people recognize without food or water you're going to wither, right? And with that kind of withering will lead to death. Right? I mean, that's just like a survival instinct. You need to eat and drink in order to stay alive, right? And so they know that when Edwin doesn't have food or water, that he's going to, you know, deteriorate until he dies. If you leave someone in a bunker for 6 days or 2 weeks or whatever, that's what's going to happen. And in a way, one might point out, right, that's a much more conscious decision to let someone suffer harm than Brain, right, who in a moment of panic doesn't see the asthma inhaler. It's a much more sort of, you could say, conscious act of infliction of harm on someone else. So that here we have two deaths caused by neglect, essentially, not an active, or you could say they're not acts of infliction of harm so much as withholding the right kind of intervention that would save someone. Right? They fail to save. In both cases, it's a failure to save in complex circumstances or not so complex circumstances, right? So that you can see how they get lined up. And here we have these boys, a much greater degree of negligence, right, than Brain in a sense. Sarah.
Yeah, and also, weren't they interviewed within those 6 days too, and denied like knowing anything, and then directly lied about it too?
Lied about actions and Edwin, right? So they could have even saved him, but they chose to lie and obstruct, you know, the inquiry into where Edwin was, and that another contribution to his death. Kaya?
You could argue that it's just like because they're kids, you know, it seems like a very childlike response. Just to be like, if I leave it alone, the problem will go away and you won't have to worry about it anymore.
Right. That's the child's response. Deny, right? And that where you think a child thinks he or she can get away with it by denying, right? That'll somehow make it magically go away. And here we see that. I mean, that's in part. And you can see, like, this is where it comes back to Gardner's point about the father beating him, right? Is that they're so afraid of getting, you know, the crap kicked out of them that they deny in order to protect themselves. So in some ways, that's the link back to the first point. Gabrielle?
It just doesn't seem like that's a legitimate, like, when it's in between, like, getting in trouble for, like, locking somebody up for, like, a little bit, or, like, eventually getting in trouble because you murdered somebody, like, they're old enough to know that they need to go back and let him out.
Okay, so
they are responsible for their actions in this case.
Okay, so they are morally responsible for their actions, right? That when you endanger someone's life, it's that basic notions of survival, food and water, right? Protection from the elements, those kinds of things. Human life can't be sustained without it. That when you take those things away from someone, whether it's locking him outside, in the winter, or taking food and water away from them, whatever they is, with that there, death is going to come about. Leah?
I disagree with that. I think the fact that their children had takes away the responsibility a lot by a huge person. Because children, especially as that young, their sense of reasoning and sense of right and wrong is not fully developed. They obviously they knew that what they did was wrong, but they didn't know that it was wrong on the level of empathy. They know that it's wrong because they could possibly get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they're avoiding it, I think, so they don't get in trouble. But the true action, like it's not fully thinking in their mind.
Okay, so that, like, in a sense, what you're saying is their avoidance of responsibility is evidence of immature reason. In a sense that you're emphasizing that you said it's not fully cooked, right? There's a notion of like maturity and immaturity, and they're unable at that age, 12 or 13 or whatever, to come to terms with the consequences of their actions, and so they can't be held legally responsible. And I'm sure in the Norwegian legal system they would not be held legally responsible. They'd be tried as juveniles, and actually, if you've looked at all about Scandinavian justice systems, or like for example this Breivik trial, I think I mentioned the first day of class, that even what we think of as like capital offenses might get 10, 12 years, and then you get prison release and so forth along the way. So it's not a system like ours. It's about punishment so much as rehabilitation, and juvenile crimes like this would be the kids would be quite protected from the kinds of law and order kind of justice that we think of as pretty typical. Try him as an adult. It's like that kind of thing. So interesting, but good defense. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, if they were sitting on the docks and then they jokingly like pushed him into the water, and then they didn't really know that he couldn't swim and he died because he drowned, that would be completely different than locking him up, knowing that he's locked up, knowing that they can save him from dying because he doesn't have anything, versus like, oh my gosh, he's like flailing in water, he's really, really large, he can't get out. And then like that's, they're just like completely different.
Okay, so try to make some distinctions.
Even though they might not be tried as adults within that legal system, like they're still responsible. Like they're completely responsible. I don't think that they can just say, "Oh, they were."
Well, I mean, one of the things you could say too, right, is that maybe one way to sort of parse it is talk about moral responsibility and legal responsibility. That legally, it's that for like a minor, one could argue that you can't hold them legally responsible because of their lack of familiarity or lack of adult sort of understanding of a legal system and how it works. But morally, right, people understand in a moral sense a kind of an obligation to help another, right? And you see small kids, right, helping one another, and everyone knows about cooperation and so forth. And in part, that's the conflict here, is like a sense of their moral responsibility to another, to their friend, right, versus a legal culpability for an action that they're that they don't maybe fully understand. So that, but in any case, right, they're sort of depicted, as monsters, right? Perhaps, and we can take up a little bit later, the parallel. I mean, it's like a clear parallelism to brain, right? Who's the more monstrous? Who's the real criminal? Who are the real criminals here? And then, of course, the other issue is, Jonas August is presented. He's like the innocent child, the figure of the innocent child, right? Where these boys are like, it's the Lord of the Flies, right? They're cruel, they're mean, they're merciless, right? That's a total lack of mercy or attempts to mitigate the consequences of one's actions when you let someone, starve and die in some little bunker, right? So the innocent child versus the evil child, two different models of the kid here. Anyone talk about other examples before we talk a little bit more about the keyword? Other examples of why criminal? So anyway, just to turn to this to the keyword, right? I mentioned already sort of like a notion of legal definition, the violation of the law, right? Where there's legal codes, and to be a criminal is to violate them, and be found guilty of doing so. But right, there's also moral definitions of crime. For example, when you think of the crime of slavery, right, where a legal system in the United States till 1865, or whenever the Emancipation Proclamation was, 1864, and we think of slavery as an anathema. Right now, it's legal to enslave someone is a crime, and yet and we recognize historically slavery as a legal crime, as a rather a moral crime, and yet legal for a long period of American history. So that one thing you can say about the criminal is it changes historically, right? For example, even a more mundane example, or less sort of morally offensive one, think about marijuana, right? Today, in the state of Washington, right, it's legal, or about to be legal, right? And 10 years ago, illegal, right? So big changes, decriminalization over time. So what was criminal is no longer criminal on a technical definition. You can think of other kinds of things like that. I mentioned the example before of domestic violence, where 40, 50 years ago, the police get called to a domestic incident. Maybe someone's been beaten badly, usually a man beating a woman, right? Oh, this is a private matter. No charges are brought now, right? The police are obligated to bring someone to incarcerate someone overnight, right? If there's a domestic violence complaint that occurs, right? If they open the door and there's that kind of call, they're obligated to do so. So there's a criminalization that occurs as acts are defined as a criminal. So this is just to point out that the seams that the novel's working are in some ways the ambiguities. They're about changing ideas of what the legal is, or rather what the criminal is, in relationship to both its legal definition and moral definition. And some of these novels, in some ways, work with those tensions between the legal definition of crime and the moral definition of crime. So then you can ask beneath that, like, what is the criminal act? If we think about it in moral terms, to harm someone else, maybe that's one way that if you think about it, or philosophers have written about these things, would define the criminal act is to cause harm. Of course, we can think of lots of ways in which we cause harm to others. That are can be quite harmful, whether they're sort of participation in some system, whether it's like global capitalism, for example. When you think about the way that you use resources, we can think of the environment today, right, as the kind of harms that are visited on people in other parts of the world because of one part of the world's sort of use of resources, right, where that disrupts the environment one way, or the ecology in one part of the world, and as a result, that sort of like butterfly effect ripples out to other parts of the world, and say there's massive drought and impoverishment and famine and so forth, where there's an argument to be made that one part of the world's use of resources causes enormous harm for another part of the world, right? Or acid rain, for example, or things like that, where there's a visiting of harm, and yet are those crimes? We would have trouble defining them as certainly can't define them as legal crimes, right? That's just the way the system works. But morally, that's part of the environmental movement's argument, is that we need to think about moral responsibility as much as legal responsibility. So these are the kinds of things that the sort of, I guess you could say, philosophical issues that are raised. And in part has to do with intention, right? If you buy a plastic bottle of water that, this contributes to the use of petroleum products that ultimately are poisoning the planet, you can hardly feel like you can be held legally responsible for a crime, right? That's just the way the system works. And yet, morally, right, there's you can start to think about it and say, well, I don't want to do that. Now, a lot of people do make those choices, right? They're vegetarians or something like that for moral reasons. And in part, what we get back to is like intention, do you try? Are you trying to cause harm to others, or are your intentions not to cause harm? But then, of course, on the other side of that coin, you can say, well, you need to be aware of the consequences of your actions. And this is a novel, I would argue, in thinking about the criminal, that just wants us to think about those kinds of dimensions of actions, especially as they relate to children. So thinking about the criminal in The Water's Edge raises these questions of what is a crime and what does intention have to do with it, what are the legal and moral definitions of a crime. Let's stop a few minutes before the bell here, take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start up again after the break and talk about the novel in more specific terms.